Good morning, everybody. My name is Ray Offenheiser. I'm the director of the Initiative for Global Development, and delighted that all of you could make it this morning. This is a very busy week here at Notre Dame. There's many events going on, so we're grateful that all of you could join us. For me, it's a distinct pleasure to introduce to you this morning our keynote speaker and my friend of many years, Rachel Kyte. Rachel is currently the Chief Executive Officer of Sustainable Development for All. She was asked to assume this post by former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who also appointed her at the same time as Special Envoy for Sustainable Energy for All and the co-chair of UN Energy. Current Secretary General Antonio Guterres asked her to continue in this role when he assumed his post in January of 2017. And in that role, Rachel is the point person for all the work being done under the United Nations in the advancement of alternative energy solutions globally. Quite an important mandate for us all. Prior to assuming this role, Rachel held a variety of high-level positions within the World Bank as its first ombudsperson handling grievances regarding the International Finance Corporation's program performance and violations of its safeguard policies, as vice president of the IFC's Business Advisory Services, and finally as vice president for sustainable development of the World Bank. In this last role, she oversaw all programs related to climate change and sustainability. She was the lead representative and spokesperson for the World Bank on climate in the lead up to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. And she's been on the front lines of the fight for sustainability and climate justice for much of the last decade. Well, that's the official biography. And since I've known Rachel for almost 30 years, I think she'll allow me the liberty of embellishing that rather bureaucratic-sounding resume and hopefully set the stage for her remarks. While those various titles would seem a sufficient career for anyone, there was a Rachel before the United Nations and the World Bank that belies that image and whose description may give you more insight into who Rachel really is and what she stands for. I first met Rachel in the early 1990s when she was a tireless NGO advocate working for women's reproductive rights at the global UN-sponsored summits on population and women's rights in Cairo and Beijing. These events were watershed moments for the global women's rights movement, and Rachel was at the heart of the action. She was a part of a small but powerful group of feminist activists who played a critical role in shaping the major conclusions of these two historic summits. They achieved this through extraordinarily shrewd politics and smart strategy. What was evident, even in those early years, was Rachel's fierce commitment to equal rights and social justice for women across the globe. While still quite young, she proved to be a highly skilled campaigner and an advocate, always managing to wangle her way in the door and operate at the highest levels. Since then, she has moved effortlessly across multiple institutional boundaries and into quite unique and different roles. In each, she always manages to be at the center of the most urgent public policy debates. She likes a good fight. And if you're smart, you generally want to be on her side in that fight. In her current role, Rachel has picked the most important fight of all to make her life's work: the fight to save our planet, our way of life, our civilization, from the existential threat of climate change. For her, sustainable energy for all is indeed about the long-term development goal of giving light to a young girl in Africa so she might huddle over a book at night with her siblings. But the act of providing light to that girl from a renewable energy source is for her linked equally to a more important priority, to ensuring that there is light and a decent, sustainable future, not only for that girl, but for her children and for her children's children. Just last week, we have seen a typhoon of unprecedented scale sweep across Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, leaving massive flooding, devastating crops and livestock and livelihoods, and killing hundreds of people. Just to the west of us, there is a massive, unprecedented flooding across the upper Midwest that is causing similar loss of property and livelihoods. Over the last 2 years, Houston, Texas has experienced 2 massive floods on a scale never before seen. Last year, a hurricane leveled Puerto Rico. The economic losses from each of these events are astronomical. Such losses will increase in time beyond anything our society can afford. This is the reality of extreme weather events that climate scientists have predicted for the last several decades. David Wallace Wells, in his new book entitled The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, provides a vivid and frankly terrifying portrait of the world as temperatures rise beyond the 2-degree threshold. The threshold that climate scientists have told us only a month ago we will not only reach, but perhaps surpass by 2050. Without serious action to accelerate the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy, it is very possible global temperatures could increase by 4.5 degrees before the end of this century. That scenario would be catastrophic and unleash even more ferocious weather events, melt the permafrost in Siberia, release tons of stored carbon, and dramatically speed up the cycle of warming. Sea level rise would quickly prove to be unmanageable for most coastal cities. Forest fires would become even more frequent. Insect and wildlife populations would begin to decline and perhaps collapse, undermining plant propagation. Farming and food production would prove impossible in the brutally regions north and south of the equator. Populations would be forced to migrate en masse to the milder climates to the north. In his final, most dramatic message, Wallace Wells reminds us that the Earth has experienced 5 previous mass extinctions. He worries that our current way of life and our dominant model of economic growth may be setting the stage for the 6th mass extinction. He could imagine that this could take place during the life of our grandchildren or great-grandchildren, and he is not alone in this belief. In the interim, even if we start taking radical measures tomorrow, this century will be defined by the climate challenge and how we manage the energy transition. This is a tough message to hear, I know. It's easier to retreat into our daily tasks and presume that temperatures will rise predictably to 2 degrees and stop. We will, of course, have to make a few adjustments, but we will learn to cope. Sorry, temperature rise will not stop at 2 degrees. So what's our option? Given the greed and indifference of global elites and the increasing dysfunction of our contemporary political systems, the only answer to this pending crisis is dramatic action by citizens across the globe. Al Gore and Bill McKibben have been prophets on this issue for almost 2 decades. But at this point, prophetic voices are not enough. Mass citizen action is absolutely essential. We must face these challenging realities and confront some profound questions. Is, for example, a capitalist economic model compatible with our goals of global sustainability? If not, how do we reimagine an economic model that really is? The emergence of a 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, a Swedish high schooler, prompting mass walkouts and marches across Europe demanding action on climate is reassuring. The legal case filed by a group of teenagers in the federal district court in Washington state suing the federal government for the violation of their constitutional right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and the court's willingness to hear that case is energizing. The unlikely partnership between climate activists and major global corporations at the Paris climate talks was a powerful reason that the Paris climate deal was achieved. And the emergence of new faces and voices in Congress pressing for a Green New Deal is cause for hope. But in all of these cases, watch how quickly they are dismissed in the media as naive, ignorant, immature, left-wing. The propaganda machine defending fossil fuels is immense and powerful. As was recently revealed through leaks of internal documents from Exxon, the industry has understood the reality of climate change for over 4 decades, but it has continuously denied it publicly. Despite the pleas of the prophets, student activists, new political voices, and the private sector, we are simply not acting fast enough to meet the agreed Paris targets, and more importantly, to keep the global temperature rise below 2 degrees centigrade. This is a complex political process, as well as a challenging technical one. So now that I've got your passions aroused and ready to have Rachel call you to action, let me conclude this somewhat unorthodox introduction with a poem for your reflection. It is one I think Rachel will approve of, and I hope appropriate for her own work. It's entitled An Ode to Dirt. It is by the award-winning poet Sarah Olds, presently on the faculty of New York University. Ode to Dirt by Sharon Olds. Dear Dirt, I am sorry I slighted you. I thought that you were only the background for the leading characters, the plants and animals and humans. It's as if I had loved only the stars and not the sky, which gave them space in which to shine. Subtle, various, sensitive, you are the skin of our terrain. You are our democracy. When I understood I had never honored you as a living equal, I was ashamed of myself, as if I had not recognized a character who looked so different from me. But now I can see us all, made of the same basic materials, cousins of that first exploding from nothing, in our intricate equation together. Oh, dirt, help us find ways to serve your life, you who have brought us forth and fed us, who at the end will take us in and rotate with us and wobble and orbit. I can think of few individuals better suited to frame and lead this transition to a sustainable future than Rachel Kyte. So without further ado, let me give you Rachel Kyte.
I love Sharon Olds. Thank you so much for reading that poem. And thank you, Ray, for that extremely generous introduction. I have a little frog in my throat, but we're going to get through this. There's one passage of David Wallace Wells' book, which if you haven't read it, you should, by the way, where he talks about the fact that most of the damage that we've done by putting so much pollution into the atmosphere has been since we've known the implications of that. So since 1992, when the Earth Summit took place in Rio. And my career started around about that time. And I have to tell you, it's kind of devastating. In an appropriate way, I think, to realize that you've spent your entire professional career working on something and the kids are right. And I don't know how much you, being here in the Midwest, how much you have seen the size of these demonstrations on the streets by children. But in Europe, where it started, not more than like 2.5 months ago, really, it's enormous. And I was in Dublin on Friday, so kids walk out of school and strike on a Friday, and then various politicians worry that they're going to, damage their education. But I was walking to a meeting in Dublin on Friday, and I was walking against a sea of children. There were about 20,000 kids walking through the streets of Dublin on a Friday in all kinds of different school uniforms. And as I was walking, I would say, oh, well done, thank you. And then sort of teenage girls would go, oh, she said thank you, And I meant it from the bottom of my heart. And by the time I got to where I was going, I was so moved by this. I had to sort of walk around the block 2 more times. Because what they've done is sort of take us from urgency to emergency. And it's a very interesting thought exercise for all of you in your research, in your studies, and in your teaching, to think about, well, what would it mean if we understood that this was an emergency? And what would we do differently in an emergency? So imagine that the air raid warning was going. Well, what would you do? I mean, you wouldn't just carry on as business as usual. You wouldn't just turn the thermostat down 1 degree. You wouldn't just sort of not eat a burger for 1 day, right? So I think that it's an interesting thought exercise, and I've actually asked ministers, so if this was an emergency, so in the UK, for example, we have a tried and tested way. There's an emergency, either a security emergency or something else. There is a cabinet committee that is called by the Prime Minister, and it meets every morning at 8 o'clock until the emergency is managed or dissipated. And everybody's in the room. Every ministry, every non-ministerial function that's needed, the police, the voluntary services, the youth organizations, the tourism authority, everybody's in the room to get the country through this emergency. At which point something different would happen, because you wouldn't have the Ministry of Energy arguing with the Chancellery about whether or not we could move out heat pumps and move everybody, gas-fired heat pumps, and move everybody onto something else, which was an option 8 years ago, but was declined because of austerity, but has now been introduced now. 8 years too late, but at least we've done it. But you wouldn't have that fight. And one of the things I want, in the context of what I want to say to you today, I want you to think about the fact that we each have our own truths. The people that we saw on the screens in the last talk, ministers, young people, we each have our own truths, but we are not talking the truth to each other about the transitions ahead of us. We are not yet speaking the truth to each other about what we will have to do to put this planet back on track, or put ourselves back on track to have a balanced planet, our ability to live with it. And if we won't speak the truth to each other, we're going to have a hard time getting to the speed and the scale that I'm now going to talk about. So thank you, everybody involved in this research symposium. Thank you to everybody at Notre Dame for inviting me. Thank you especially to Ray, but also to Peter Burns. It's a great honor to be here on this historic campus at this historic place of learning. The ethic at the very heart of this university's mission is one which you need to dig deep into in order to help make this world a better place, to heal this world. It also puts you at this particular moment in history in a very important place, because you can make a substantial contribution, and we need everybody's contribution. The challenge is we need no carbon and we need more energy. Well, I mean, we can do that in a lab. We know how to do that. We just haven't yet worked out exactly how quickly we're prepared to do that within the global economy. We have to provide everyone with the means, so sufficient energy services that they would need to survive, thrive, and be productive within the economy. But that's not how most energy planners think about things. Most energy planners think about how many gigawatts costing me, how many billions do I need to put into a system that will somehow generate the economic growth that we've set as a target in another room with other people. Turn it around and ask the question, how much energy does each household need? How much energy does each business need in order to be able to be productive? And you actually end up probably in some cases with quite different answers, and certainly different answers about how you could perhaps achieve reaching that goal. So we have to decarbonize the energy system, decarbonize the economy. We have to do that in an era of huge opportunity. So people tend to think that that's daunting, and yet we sit at the pivot of an extraordinary set of technological advances, an extraordinary shift in our understanding of business models about how those technologies can be deployed and therefore accessed by those who are traditionally non-served by the energy systems that we've grown up with. And so it is possible that the furthest from our minds or the last mile can be served first. And if in doing that we were able then to lift up everybody between us and them, then we would have energy systems that function more fairly and probably better for the economy. The opportunities are also at hand because we actually have the finance to be able to do most of what we want to be able to do. Now, we tend to think in terms of the tens and tens of trillions of dollars that will be needed to invest in the infrastructure that we need. But that money exists within the economy. It's just incentivized to invest in other things than infrastructure. It is stuck and accumulated in pockets and not put to good use within economies and across the global economy. And there are very real reasons for this, but there are very real reasons why we can fix this. I mean, we have never, in a low interest rate environment since the last financial crisis, taken the opportunity to invest at scale in infrastructure. Not here, not in Europe, and certainly not sufficiently into emerging markets in the developing world. And so it isn't that we don't have the cash, it's that we haven't made the decisions to shift the financing to where it would actually have the greatest impact. We still have far too many harmful subsidies, and we have a system which doesn't count the fully externalized cost of a harmful fossil fuel energy system just into the public, into our health, into the health of our children. And so that piece of the economy is done very well and has done so, quote unquote, cheaply, because we've never really counted the cost of what that was doing to the society as well as to the economy. And as soon as you start to count it in, then all of those arguments about, well, solar's cheaper than coal, oh, well, no, it isn't, yes, it is. I mean, the numbers would really start to fall away. And we could have a conversation about investing in an infrastructure that would actually meet everybody's needs. And so we wouldn't be pitting people against pollution. We wouldn't be blaming poor people for wanting to have energy and saying that that will be the demise of an energy system and that will be the demise of our efforts to combat climate change. We can actually square the circle quite nicely, and with the technology and finance available to us today, meet the needs of everybody, meet them cleanly, and build the infrastructure that will be resilient, and build the infrastructure that can meet everybody's needs, and actually grow the economy. And guess what? The countries that are doing that, Chile and Argentina, Morocco, they're seeing all of the results of this. And the countries that are beginning to do it, the Kenyas and the Ethiopias of this world, are beginning to see the results as well. So these are the opportunities. We also have an opportunity in the amount of digitalization that we can deploy into these energy systems that will allow us to manage demand in a sophisticated way. And guess what? The sophistication of the decisions that people living on extremely low incomes make every day, and how digitalization will allow them, and new technology will allow them to be able to use the sophistication of their financial decision-making already to be able to access the services they want. That's already there. We already know that through some of the work in mobile telephony, some of the business models that are being built out. But what we tend to think is that technology is coming to people who perhaps aren't sophisticated and it's helping them. You misunderstand the sophistication of what it takes to survive on less than $2 a day. You don't get $2 every day. You get 10, and then you go 3 weeks, and then maybe you get 50 cents, and then maybe you get 11 the next day, and then you go another month and you don't have anything, and and if you walk into a low-income neighborhood in Chicago or a low-income neighborhood in East London, in the east of London, those are the sophisticated decision-making that those families make, and normally it's the woman that makes the decision. So in the east of London, the woman who has 50 pence to put into the meter or a pound coin to put into the meter, and she can calculate down to the second how long it will take for the oven to use that pound, and whether or not she can cook chicken and vegetables for her kids for a Sunday lunch. That's the sophistication that we're dealing with, that digitalization will empower, is empowering, and we can imagine this bottom-up energy system meeting the top-down energy system that energy planners spend so much time working on. So there is extraordinary opportunity for us to meet the challenges of decarbonizing an energy system and meeting everybody's needs in it. But we are ill-served by the energy institutions of today, and we're ill-served by the way in which we collaborate internationally on energy. There is no consensus on the theory of change. We have a consensus at the political level at the point on the horizon. That comes from the Paris Climate Agreement, and that comes from the Sustainable Development Goals. But exactly how we get there, I don't think we have an agreement on. And there is a cheaper, easier, faster way to get there, and there's an expensive, conflictual way to get there. And it's going to be interesting to see which ones of these paths different people follow. But I'm here to tell you that it is within our grasp, and your work will help us to get to that point on the horizon. It is not an impossible place to reach. But we can see with this lack of an agreement on a theory of change, people hedging their bets. We see oil and gas companies betting on their ability to become global energy services companies. We see them betting in different proportions on whether gas will be a bridge from the energy mix we have today to a 100% renewable energy mix in the future. But we also see them lobbying on the opposite side. And so for companies that will sit in the United Nations and ask for effective carbon pricing, they have no qualms to spend considerable amounts of money in Washington State or through the American Petroleum Institute or through the energy lobbies of the EU to make sure that no such aggressive policies are put in place now, maybe in the future, but not now. But of course, time is the one thing we don't have. And so we can also see the China watching, and for those of you who are looking at how China is managing its own energy transition, We can see the hesitation within the body politic there. The shift to renewables and the incredible speed with which that has happened. At the same time, having to manage the political fallout of shuttering the coal companies and the other parts of the Chinese state that are so powerful and that have done so well in managing that resource. How much can China advance if it just exports its coal problems to the rest of the world through the Belt and Road Initiative? Can India's grid stabilize itself quickly enough to be able to absorb renewables while it manages the significant exposure of state-owned banks to coal companies? And can it do so while maintaining a democratic advantage? Can Africa leapfrog? Can it increase its domestic investment into its own energy systems and then attract in the kind of foreign direct investment and deploy concessional finance appropriately in order to improve grid performance, densify the grid in cities, serving more people affordably, shift the transfer of subsidies from harmful to clean, build the utilities of the future, integrate regulations so that off-grid or distributed energy can operate alongside the grid, and create a marketplace whereby more and more firms can come in, operate and solve some of the problems that these countries have, including and especially reaching those who are beyond the power lines and below the power lines today with affordable, reliable and clean energy. How many African countries can really forego the 2, 3, 4 percentage points of GDP growth because their rural populations don't have access to services? And can the developed world, can we drive energy productivity through our economies with the single-minded determination that we need to? And can we find joy in that? At the moment, the fact that energy efficiency has remained stubbornly for the last 30 years the least sexy thing that anybody can work on has really held us back. So it's your challenge to make this the most exciting thing it can be. So, as I said, we're ill-served by the energy institutions, and one example of this is that we have no one data set that we can all sort of play with and agree on. The International Energy Agency, which is an outgrowth of the OECD, and which is increasingly considered by many policymakers and countries as the go-to energy source, data source for this transition, is not open source. We don't know what assumptions it uses at the front end of its models, and then we wonder why it is consistently wrong on the output end of its models. It has been wrong in predicting the rise of renewable energy and its penetration every year for more than 18 years. It has been systematically wrong in all other elements of the energy transition, and yet that's the data set everybody's expected to use. So I urge you as academics, as members of the academy, as students, to simply hashtag open source in all of your work. This is a grand problem. This is a civilization problem. We're all in this together, and all of us should be working together and really arguing and playing and pushing around with the numbers until we're comfortable. And we will ill-serve countries that have limited capacity to manage the transition anyway if we can't make that data open source. The energy transition is a decarbonizing story, it's a decentralizing story, it's a digitalizing story. It's effectively the democratization of energy. Where you get your energy from, how you will pay for your energy, this is all going to change. The historic relationship of a consumer to an energy source has completely changed, which is another reason, again, why data needs to be open source. So I want to talk about, in the title of this address, I sort of talked about some of the areas which I think don't get enough attention. And being here at Notre Dame, I hope that these are things that I know that some of you are already working on, but we need to do much more work. So it's surprising to me that we don't spend more time on the thermal economy. There is a superfluous narrative around the energy transition, or a superficial one, which I hear a lot in the corridors of power, whether it's the G20, the UN, World Bank, whatever, which is just about electricity and its generation, and then how far we can get it to and what price we can get it to people on. But deep down in the economy is a thermal economy. The heating and cooling and the extraordinary wastefulness within that cycle, within our economy. And it's only recently that I've started to see this really become a focus. There's extraordinary work that can be done there. My little angle of this is a very discrete question. It is simply, how do we, in a world that is warming, in a world where we have to be hyper-efficient, and in a world where we need to supply energy services to everyone affordably and reliably and cleanly, and in a world where we cannot afford to put super pollutants, short-lived climate pollutants into the atmosphere anymore either, in a world where we've actually agreed to do all of those three things, it's the confluence of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. In that world, how do we ensure that everyone has access to cooling for comfort or survival, cooling, a cold chain for their medicines and their vaccines, and a cold chain for safe food? And our work and our analysis has shown that if we don't get our arms around this problem of cooling from a position of equity and justice, we are going to have tens of millions of people dying unnecessarily from heat stress in the growing cities of Africa and Asia in particular, but also, you know, the Midwest and the southern cities of the United States as well, where death from heat stress is a pure income discrimination and ethnicity and race discrimination issue. If you have resources, you can get yourself to a cool place. If you don't, you can't. But it's also a question of the food safety and the agricultural yield and productivity of Indian farmers, farmers across Southeast Asia, farmers across Africa. And it will be the only way that we are able to continue the amazing progress we've made in vaccination over the last 20 years. But the next time we have an Ebola, or the next time we have an outbreak of some kind of zoonotic disease or some kind of disease of that kind, our ability to get medicines to people and vaccines to people will depend upon a reliable cold chain. But we can't do it the way we used to do it. We can't do it in an energy inefficient way, and we can't do it with HFCs. And it's been very interesting to me focusing in on this problem, because you realize how blind policymakers are to the thermal economy. They don't think about heating and cooling. You also realize that the energy efficiency world and the ozone protection world are two entirely different worlds with two entirely different theories of change. And there is a role for the academy to bring them together and keep them together and keep them working together. But most importantly is that the voice of the end consumer is not heard in these debates. And so what you don't hear is what will actually work for the farmer, what will actually work for the patient in the hospital. And so it's been interesting to me to see how this issue has become treated. It's become, of course, a story of like, oh, goodness me, if every poor person in a poor country suddenly expects to have an air conditioner, as if this is sort of expecting to have a Fabergé egg for Christmas, then we're going to have a problem. This is not the right way to look at the problem. I mean, first of all, to expect to have access to cooling is not a luxury. It will be a matter of survival in cities where temperatures will reach 49, 50, 51 degrees Celsius and stay there for days on end. But it's also not beyond our ability to be able to fix the problem. And so we were very proud, and I was very excited to be involved in a cooling prize together with the Rocky Mountain Institute, the government of India, Tata, and many, many other partners, where the prize, a $6 million prize pool, is for the team, and we have 3,500 teams who've entered already, who can build a household air conditioning unit at 5 times the efficiency of anything on the market today, that could retail at a price point for a low-middle-income Indian. We did it for the Indian market to begin with, and which is HFC-free. And I'm quite sure that we're going to have multiple solutions to that. And so this is the way we have to ask the right question and then pursue it with dogged determination. The same is going to be true for all of those cars, those electric, sometimes driverless cars that we think we're going to be moving around in. They're all going to have mobile air conditioning units as well, otherwise we're going to get, they're not going to be used in the way that we want to, and they're not going to solve the problems of the cities in the way that we hope that they will. Again, all of the attention is on the Chinese market and the growth of electric vehicles, and in the fact that everybody in Oslo seems to drive an electric vehicle. The real challenge is how do we make sure that every light good vehicle, heavy goods vehicle, and bus and jalopy in every developing country city is electrified as soon as possible, because that will not only be a solution to climate change, but it will be the only way to guarantee the economic productivity of those cities. It will be the only way to guarantee that lower income people can get to work and stay in work. And it will be the only way to guarantee that those cities' air quality will not end up as London's is today, or Paris's is today, or Delhi, or Shanghai, or Beijing. And let me tell you, there's one thing that unites African leaders, is that they do not want to have that productivity problem in 10 years or 20 years. Again, not beyond our ability, but the public policy needed to drive public procurement, and the public policy needed to drive the investment into R&D into that section of the automotive market is not where it should be right now. Let's talk about shipping. All those things that we wear and that we use every day, 10% of emissions, hugely inefficient from a thermal economy perspective. This is a question of ships themselves, of ports, and of the producers of the cargo that the ships carry. So we've calculated that it's only 1 cent on a T-shirt if the container ship moving across the Atlantic or across the Pacific was actually going on 50% biofuels as opposed to the bunker fuels that it would use today. So there's no major uprising of the consumer if we were able to act on this. And so all of those companies that have committed to 100% renewable energy, RE100, and who are struggling with what to do in their supply chains are going to have to start demanding that the shipping companies deal with this. For ports, the ports will tell you that the ships come in and belch their dirty fuel and there's nothing they can do. But we believe that the ports can come together and form a cartel and simply start introducing more clean fuels, and the ships will have nothing to do or say about that because those are the ports that they have to go to. And then 90% of ocean-going container shipping is built in 3 countries. It's China, Japan, and Korea. And so their climate leadership comes down to a decision of the 3 of them to actually start building their ships differently with new design which can increase efficiency. So again, if we're very focused on the way into these problems, there are solutions at hand. If we stand back and think that all 196 countries have to agree to everything and we don't actually know what to do, then it begins to be a bit more overwhelming. I haven't talked about aviation, but you should imagine that most short-haul flights will be electric within 10 to 15 years. Certainly that's what the aircraft companies I think, believe. And then how we introduce more biofuels into long-haul aircraft will be the killer question. So for me, there are not 2 discussions on climate and energy and development. It's one question, and it's the same question whether you are the woman living in a village in northern Niger without access to electricity, therefore no healthcare services, therefore nowhere to store your yield from whatever crops you are growing and no way to improve on the income from that. And the policymaker sitting in an industrialized country who needs to take a huge chunk out of the energy intensity of the economy that they're managing. These are a continuum, and what's possible is in front of us. Last year, Mission Possible, a report from the Energy Transitions Commission, talked about the hard-to-abate sectors, the bits that we thought that we couldn't do. It concluded that technically by 2050 we could have zero-carbon steel, zero-carbon refining, zero-carbon cement, zero-carbon shipping and aviation. Technically. Financially, we can do it, of course. So the question is, what is the pathway and what are the policy decisions that are needed? How much carbon capture, storage, and use do we need? Who's going to pay for it, and how quickly can it be deployed? Do we make a big bet on hydrogen? How do we make that affordable, and what do we use it for? We can use gas if we can capture the carbon from it, but when's that going to be affordable without effective carbon prices? Why don't we use more geothermal energy, both high heat and low heat? Can we not have district heating available in all cities in the north where heating is so difficult? But we start to reverse into big questions of industrial design, industrial clustering and planning, the likes of which that modern capitalist democracies have not wanted to get involved in for decades yet. So do we have the will to come together and plan in a way that we haven't wanted to plan for the last few years? The private sector, of course, will deliver most of this, but the private sector needs a steady hand from government and a long-sighted view. For me, the most exciting sort of framing of this, especially for the difficult pieces of the economy from a decarbonizing perspective, was from Robert Sokolow from Princeton, where in a small room with oil and gas executives, he said, you know, and we'd been talking about the fact that they were oil and gas companies and now they were trying to market themselves as energy services companies. And he said, really, what you need to become are carbon molecule management companies, i.e., government will have to change the regulatory framework within which they work, and investors are going to take a different view of them, and already are. But if you are going to dig gas or oil or coal out of the ground, or any hydrocarbon out of the ground, then you can do so if it will be used again and again and again, if it will be captured, and as long as none of it emits into the atmosphere. As long as you don't emit it in the atmosphere, then go at it. Now, of course, whether the economics make sense or not will be the question. But that is the challenge we have in the modern economy, is stopping for any of that emitting into the atmosphere. So in conclusion, there are lots of great things going on. In the oil and gas industry, they finally started making steps towards decreasing and capturing their methane emissions, building on the work that's been going on gas flaring for the last 10, 15 years. But most of the methane emissions come from Russia, Iran, and Iraq, and they're not part of the conversation yet. Neither are the national oil companies of many countries where major emissions need to be under control. There's extraordinary progress in energy access across India in particular, Bangladesh, but Kenya and Ethiopia making real progress. But we still have just under 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, 1 billion people worldwide, over 600 million of them in sub-Saharan Africa, who don't have access to electricity. It is impossible to imagine how Africa doesn't get left behind if they don't. But most African countries only invest less than 2% in their energy systems. And frankly, the international assistance, which is abundant and pledged, is carved up into so many different parcels with so many different conditions on it that it is impossible to imagine how it will be used at scale. My hope is that Indian companies, having mastered solar at scale in India, will simply move into the Sahel and find a way to do it themselves. Certainly, sitting in New York or in London or in Geneva and wringing our hands because we don't know how much risk to take with the 0.7% of development aid that we're supposed to spend on these things doesn't seem to me to be a business for emergency, but more of a business as usual approach to development aid. It will not help people quickly enough. These are women and men, after all, who can get access to the technology, who do have cell phones, and who are sophisticated. They just need energy systems to be deployed. In the financial sector, over $106 trillion now of assets will be reporting voluntarily through their financial management companies and then through other companies on how they see the future. This is the transparency that comes from the CARB TCFD, which was agreed by the FSB and the G20 as the mechanism by which companies and financial companies must say how they will continue to make a profit under a 2-degree scenario world. $106 trillion is not boutique. That is getting to the point of being material and mainstream. And so it is the case now that investors are starting to ask the pertinent questions of companies about how they will manage themselves through this transition. So we are at a tipping point where we can serve the lowest income people in the farthest to reach places and we can actually make huge cuts in the carbon intensity of the developed world without sacrificing anybody's dignity. But it's going to require extraordinary political will at a time that my boss, the Secretary General, worries that we have insipid political leadership on this question. What he does not worry about is businesses' ability to be able to do this, and he doesn't worry about the will because he's seen the children and the school kids on the street. So if you're a policymaker and you don't have a data set you can trust, and you've got special interests coming through the revolving door every day, it's very hard to make a decision which needs to be a no regrets decision. It's very hard to see around the corner. It's very hard to make a bet on something which will only materialize in 2 or 3 years election cycles' time. But that's the political leadership we need now, and it requires an academy to be there for it. It requires the evidence which you can provide on how to make those no-regret decisions and where those no-regret decisions lie. And it will require students and now school kids to be on the street to provide the will. No decision ever gets made on the data and the evidence alone. It's only ever made with data and evidence and an understanding of will and some emotion and some heart. And so we have to conjure up the heart in the politicians to make the decisions that we know will be no regret decisions, and we need them to make them now. The future, ladies and gentlemen, really is in your hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. You definitely highlighted the need for new planning models, new business models, new design models. And of course, when we go into developing countries, the less risk situation is to rely on things that we know. And certainly in engineering and higher education, we tend to teach toward the status quo. And so, given that we are in a higher educational setting, what needs to change in higher education as far as how we actually think about training this new wave of students that are coming in who really care about these issues?
Well, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I might be the president of one of these august bodies or something. But no, so I think, first of all, the world is flat. And so I think collaboration is incredibly important. And I know that, many of you in the room collaborate with institutions in the developing world. But I think that increasingly it's going to be in collaboration that you get to see the problem from all angles, right? So I know you work with Makerere, for example. So I mean, if you look at, working with Chinese, with Singaporean, with Australian, with African, with American, with European academic institutions, it's in that collaboration that I think we understand how well and the importance of that is that there is leapfrogging opportunities, and I think that people really don't want to know. People aren't looking mainly to the developed world for most of the solutions. I mean, most developing countries want to be Korea or Singapore. They don't really want to be UK. I'll say that safely at the moment. They don't want to be the UK or Germany. Or they want to understand the energy event, but they want to transition really quickly, and they want to do it the way that Singapore and Korea did. So I think understanding that the world is flat and collaborating more is really important. I think the other thing is that there is a responsibility. I mean, the open data point is a political point, but it's a real one. The amount of sort of lobbying that goes on around, trying to make a quick buck on an old technology is quite extraordinary. And of course, everybody points to China. And I heard Condi Rice. I was very honoured to get one of the very difficult tickets for Condi Rice and John Kerry last night. And Condi Rice, who I agreed with on 99% of what she said, actually, did sort of dismiss China as imperial. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a British passport holder. I know a lot about imperial tendencies, but the US is frankly seen as imperial as well. China has been eating the United States lunch in Africa for the last 10, 15 years. Now, whether the outcome's a desired one or not, the Africans will figure that out, and they are figuring that out. But I don't think it's a moment for Schadenfreude. It's a moment for, so what do we have to offer that's better? So the problem that policymakers have at the moment is if you want to build, let's say you think you need another IPP, power plant, right? So somebody, up until very recently, the Chinese would come, they would offer you the kit, they would offer you subsidized finance, they'd offer you the workers, and they'd tell you that it could be built in 2 to 3 years, and it would connect into your really pretty ropey grid. Job done, right? You can go back to the electorate, say, we've got another few hundred megawatts of electricity coming through this power plant. And we're all sort of bemoaning that China is exporting coal, and right. Meanwhile, we, as the West, have done absolutely nothing through the G20 or any other mechanism to spur the amount of investment into infrastructure over the period where we were, supposedly in control. And if you want to build the alternative to coal, you have to go to 5 different acronyms to help you with your planning. Somebody will help you with stabilization of the grid, somebody will help you with the plan, somebody will help you with alternatives and scenarios, somebody might help you with some capacity building, and then you'll have to go to another 5 to get the financing for maybe solar with hydro or wind with your gas or something, and you don't know that it's going to work, but you're promised that it will. And it will take 10 to 13 years, and the NGOs will stop it because of safeguards 3 or 4 times, and it might end up in the Supreme Court. So if you're the policymaker, you've got to have, and so our challenge in the developed world is to put a like-for-like offer on the table. We have to put the cash on the table, and we have to put the technical assistance package that says, okay, you can go build this coal-fired power plant, these are all the downsides, these are the reasons why you shouldn't do it, but we can offer you something which is better, and here's how you can do it, and here's how you can do it quickly. And until we get to the point of that, I think that we're out of the game. And so, I know that a lot of people are already working on that. There's great work on tracking the finance and the spend of China and really understanding why countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, what they really want and how they ask for what they want, how they could ask differently. That work's being done by Tufts and Boston College, Boston University and others. Great work coming out of Tsinghua and LSE about how the dynamics of this are. So, I think the Academy needs to be providing real-time solutions for what are real-time problems. We don't have very many years to start getting this right. And, pointing out why people are wrong is one thing. Helping institutions provide an alternative so that they could be right now is another thing. Sorry, I went off topic a bit there. So I'll take one question here and then one at the back. I'll take 2 together.
So I have a real practical question built off the discussion you have, which I'm very moved about, is the discussion on the sophistication of markets and innovations in so-called unsophisticated areas, if you will. So necessity is the mother of innovation, right? There is a lot of ability to do smart grids in places that don't have a centralized grid right now. But when I've been working on economic models, because again, you have the 5 energy, got it. It's the 5 financial that you mentioned. Yeah. They're not in the economic besides levelized cost of electricity that I worry about. And one of the reasons is when I work with communities, they pull their funds together many times for this idea. I get $10 one week and then I might not get 50 cents. And so you have kind of a community banking collaborative sometimes or association. And when you start brainstorming about smart grids, right, energy innovation centers coming together and communicating, they really want in the mix a bartering financial system. But the World Bank and other economists are fundamentally opposed to this. And as a physicist, I just don't get it. So could you help that discussion?
I would stay away from Washington. Is this live streamed? Okay, good. Hello, Washington. I would stay away. I honestly think that the innovation around the financial models from this isn't going to come from the institutions. It'll come from people who used to work in those institutions that now work elsewhere. And I think that it's actually a really, really good question, and maybe an institution as august as this or something else should bring the people who know how to do that together in a room, together with the people who know about smart grids. That conversation doesn't happen enough. In fact, you're so smart that, and you don't even know this, I think, but in June, we're hosting as SE for All a series of charrettes. And did I get grief for calling them charrettes, by the way? But I call it charrettes because I don't want it to be like any other energy conference where everybody comes and makes speeches, like me today. But you've got to come for 2.5 days. You can't just wander in, wander out. You've got to roll your sleeves up, and we're going to fix something while we're in the room. And part of the charrette is on these problems that are stopping progress because we can't get the financial models to work with the energy models. I'm not sure. Well, if you want to come to the Netherlands in the middle of June, come. Yeah. But we've only
and
just.
I hear from this a lot of people. So the women who are doing this that we talked about, can they be invited to a charrette?
Yeah, no. So,
I would absolutely have.
So they're going to be
multiple
there
ones.
together with people who are actually creative about financing. So, for example, I went to Andy Cooper. Andy Cooper is a guy who was this young guy that when I was working in the IFC would not invest in him because he didn't have enough track record. I gave him, I managed to get him a sort of concessional piece of money, but not a full investment. He went off and started building the first ever micro savings institution. This is whenever he was just doing microcredit, right? And then he built that, and he built that, and he built that, and then he became very, very, and then IFC wanted to invest in him because now he's already very good. And then he sold that to an insurance company, then he went and set up another one, and now he's done all kinds of other innovations working precisely from this perspective. So I'm like, I need you to come and sort out what the financial model is for these kinds of community off-grid or whatever. So you're right, you could do part of that. I think we could do part of that. I think if you go through the traditional institutions, they haven't connected this up yet. So you've got financial systems innovation, and then you've got, so the problems that stop people from participating in the economy, like the lack of ability to collateralize, movable assets, in the countries where you still can't, as women inherit land and all the rest of it, these still stop you from participating in the financial sector, and still too many of the rules that are going to be brought onto mobile banking are going to then sort of have an impinged effect on them. So look, more to be discussed, but yeah, there's a lot to do in this. I mean, there's all kinds of downside risks of some of the off-grid models, by the way. I talk to people in the microfinance business who are extremely worried about the sort of safeguards around identity and privacy when you've got everybody doing everything off a phone. There are huge cybersecurity risks as well. Yeah. Right, and so what happens is that if you've got somebody running a off-grid solar home system, and then the government quite rightly would like to know sort of some of the data because they want to know what demand is, etc. But as soon as you take that laptop and you plug it into the grid, and there's absolutely no security on the off-grid system, then you've got a huge additional risk. So I sit in the room talking to the cybersecurity people around grid risk, and which in of itself is terrifying. And one of the downsides to all of this decentralization is then how do we manage the cyber risks in that as well. So, but these are all things that we're smart enough to fix this stuff. At the back, and then the gentleman in front. Sure. Shout, yeah.
So obviously a global transition to renewable energy requires cooperation between countries as well. And we have the technology and have the ability to finance this, it seems to be. However, political turmoil and tensions makes that extremely complex.
Yeah.
And even so, there seems that there's no, or the frameworks around energy trade and exchange of technology are really patchwork, and like the WTO, for instance, doesn't even have a clear set of regulations for energy trade, and it doesn't seem that there's a lot of regulatory bodies that can actually manage that if we were even to be able to overcome some of the political tensions between countries. So is there a need for more of a unified international body around this topic, or what are your recommendations for overcoming these cross-country tensions?
Are you a student?
Yeah, I'm a master's student.
Master's student in what?
In sustainable development at the Keele School.
Okay, good. So then talk to me about what your PhD is going to be on, okay, afterwards. Excellent. And where you're going to do it. I'm poaching. No. So you're exactly right. I mean, what I advocated for in the run-up to Paris, when both the UN and the WTO were in a slightly better state than they are now, was that and understanding that getting the two to come together is very difficult, and understanding that setting up any new institution is nigh on impossible, is that we needed to have, you have pop-up bars, right, and pop-up restaurants, old building, let's go and use it for 30 days, whatever, yeah. Is that we need the pop-up, sort of trade and energy, trade and climate space, where you set it up and you just create the dialogue around that. There's so much mistrust within the two worlds, and the two worlds don't speak the same language. And there has been a few effective bridges built between the two, but actually one of those was run by the International Centre for Trade and Sustainable Development, which went bust in January. So we lost the sort of big bridge that we'd built over the last 20 years. And so there is a need for a space where this stuff gets teased out in almost like a track 2 diplomatic format. So it's low risk. So that we get familiarized with what the possible pathways are. Chatham House in London does good stuff on this. There are people in China, the Energy Foundation, people in China do really good work on this as well. So, but it's given how much of a burning bridge we have, it's really urgent stuff. I think the chaos in the WTO at the moment and this sort of economic nationalism around the world is really pulling away from a core issue that has to be concentrated on. So yeah, I mean, this is urgent to do stuff that isn't moving quickly enough at all, and is also vulnerable to economic nationalism and sort of a few stunts, etc. So.
Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was excellent, comprehensive. I'd like to expand upon the enormity of the difficulties that we face in making progress on this issue. And I was struck by the comments you made about China and its investment or support of coal-fired power plants happening from Africa to Southeast Asia. They're very big in Vietnam at the moment. And
yeah.
So that condition contrasted with what Tom Pericol talked about earlier, and the 110 kilowatt, 3 microgrids, I guess, that are being built in Africa. Take a 500 megawatt power plant that China is building in Africa and contrast that with the 110 kilowatts, and you would need 5,000 of those microgrids to match the power output of that 500 megawatt power plant that China is building. And actually you would need more, because that's peak power when it comes to the photovoltaic microgrids versus 24/7 baseline power for the coal-fired power plants. And it's not only China. Japan is investing in building these power plants in other nations, as is South Korea. And they can come up with the financing, and as you say, the total kits. The Chinese will also provide the labor, low-cost labor. When that power plant is built, it's going to last at least 40 years, and it's being built without carbon capture and sequestration.
Yeah.
And a comment on carbon capture and sequestration, it is just not economically viable. The expense associated with doing it, sequestering the carbon, just puts coal-fired power plants out of business and it's not economically viable for gas-fired power plants either. So these power plants are being built. Even as China winds down, decommissions its older, inefficient power plants, it is building new power plants using critical coal-fired steam technology. So I think we ought to all realize that this is a difficult road to follow in terms of integrating these clean energy technologies in a time frame that would allow us to avoid 2 degrees C. And another comment concerning air conditioning. I agree with you, or refrigeration in general, that electricity consumption globally is going up, what, 6%, 7% a year due to the air conditioning loads. That drain on electricity consumption. I'm aware of this $6 million challenge, but I also want to take a sober look at how difficult meeting that challenge is going to be. Vapor compression refrigeration technologies are very mature technologies. And I think whatever we do in terms of new technologies in the refrigeration space will likely be based upon vapor compression refrigerants. Doing away with HFCs and CFCs is doable. I mean, you can replace them with ammonia, you can replace them with carbon dioxide. Increasing the coefficient of performance by a factor of 5 is, it may be undoable. Reducing costs by a factor of 2, perhaps that's doable. So I guess the bottom line where I'm coming from is that we really need to weigh in, as you've urged us to do, on accelerating the expansion of carbon-free renewable energy technologies, but maybe we ought to be paying more attention to adaptation because I don't think we're going to get to 2 degrees C, much less 1.5 degrees C. I think the forces in play today are going to take us beyond that. So I accept the challenge. I'll do everything I can to help meet that challenge. But reality tells me that this is a tough haul.
Yeah, so I don't disagree with just sort of 3 points of light. I mean, I think, so first of all, on the cooling, I mean, the cooling, obviously, I've been very frustrated because, the problems got described as an air conditioning, not by you, but, as an air conditioning problem, right? It's like, no, we have to build buildings differently. The Indians are doing all of this work now looking at district cooling as well. I mean, so there's things you can do at scale, but there's also ways in which we are going to have to live that require less energy for cooling. And you talk to architects, talk to engineers about what's possible. I think we have to do all of that because, frankly, the human body can adapt, but only up to a point, right? And it's been very interesting talking to the vaccine people because it's about keeping everything at a steady temperature of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. But the Ebola vaccine has to be chilled at some extraordinary low temperature. It's like 40 below or something like that. It's an extreme, and that's the whole different challenge, right? So, but yeah, it's integrated systems thinking. Just on China, China's the biggest investment in energy infrastructure in Africa by a long haul. It hasn't been building that much coal, and at the moment, really the coal that people think it might build is the Lamu plant on the last pristine part of the Kenyan coast, which we hope they don't build for many different reasons. Kenya doesn't actually need that plant. It's going to have overcapacity. Anytime, I think this year or next year, it needs to build out its grid and its off-grid, and can import at 6 cents a kilowatt hour dispatched hydro from Ethiopia, and with wind coming on and solar coming on and geothermal and ramping that up, it would be okay within an East Africa power pool. But you've got vested interest, but I don't think Lamu gets built. But I do want to, I think the people who are going to build coal in Africa are actually African industrialists who are, who just don't see how they can expand unless they have reliable, affordable energy, and they don't trust the grid, and they don't trust their brothers in office either. And so I'm honored to be able to work quite closely with Aliko Dangote, the biggest industrialist in Africa. You know, and he's got 17 cement plants across Africa, 16 of which are powered by his own, you know, captive coal-fired power plants, because he can't rely on the grid. So he's like, look, you know, how am I going to industrialize and build the manufacturing capacity of Africa if I can't get electricity? If I can't get electricity, I'm going to build my own. And so the conversation is, well, why don't we build something different rather than coal? And he's like, well, you know, until you can come and tell me how to do that cheaply and easily, I'm not going to do it. So he's bought up mining licenses in Niger and things like that. He's going to become a vertical, you know, conglomerate, you know, digging up his coal, burning his coal, and running his refineries. I don't think that's the way to go, but he's like, you know, over the time frame I'm looking at, I don't see a better way yet. So we have to win the argument in his boardroom. Then the final thing I want to say just about what's going on in China, Southeast Asia. We've got 250 coal-fired power plants on the books for 7 Southeast Asian countries, and I think that includes Pakistan as well. I don't know. And you know, yeah, if they all get built, then we've got a significant problem. And I think there's been extraordinary work done in pointing out why those are not the best choices for those countries. But as I said, you know, funding the alternative isn't in place yet in an effective way. And so there's much to be done there. And then finally, just back to Africa, I often hear that, you know, well, you can build one power plant or you'd have to build, you know, a gazillion, you know, microgrids or whatever. And that's really apples and oranges, because that grid, that centralized power source is going to go into a grid which is losing 40 to 50% through transmission losses at the moment and goes as far as the grid goes. And the one thing that I have seen happen in the last 3 to 4 years is a shift in mentality in the sort of development banks that fund the grid and the transmissions and the distribution pieces of it, that from let's subsidize the grid and the utility to just add more customers, to actually building a mini grid, you know, underneath the grid is a cheaper way to add customers, and then we'll deal with connecting the mini grid to the grid at some point. And that was an argument for many years, and I think that argument's shifted now. And what I also see is in Kenya, where they have sort of levelized the regulatory framework to make it much more competitive to be in distributed energy. Because, you know, most countries put all of their subsidy into a badly managed, if not corrupt, utility to manage a badly performing grid, to make sure that the energy at the end of that is affordable because those people vote for you. So that model has to just get transformed into a model where, you know, this is the end price of electricity, this is the regulatory framework, and if you can provide it through a mini grid, if you can provide it through the grid, you know, have at it. And as soon as Kenya did that, the rise in investment in distributed energy has started to take off. And so I think people are looking very carefully at why is Kenya closing its energy access gap as quickly as it is, and why is it you know, installing the energy that it is. It's made mistakes, it will continue to make mistakes, but it's showing a trend which other countries aren't. So I think if we always look at it the old way, which is what most policymakers and planners do, it seems like an impossible task. But there are a few points of light which give me hope that we could. I mean, it's a handbrake turn, as you say in England, right? But we're going to have to try and be good enough to do it. Anybody else? That's it? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.